Okay, everybody, we're going to continue talking about some basic concepts from rhetoric today. Specifically, we're going to be talking about rhetoric in narrative and narrative writing. Narrative just means a piece of writing that tells a story. It's obviously connected to words like narrator that you use more often. The Glass Castle is an example of a narrative. So what we want to talk about in this PowerPoint is the way an author of a narrative uses rhetoric, consciously takes advantage of the way that they tell the story in order to accomplish a purpose. I'm going to be referring to a lot in this video to the concepts from the handout you have in your packet on Burke's Pentad. So it would be a good idea to read through that before you watch this video, or at least follow along with it while you're listening to the video. So let's get started. The first concept that you really need to understand when we're talking about rhetoric and narrative is that real life isn't actually a narrative. If you look at the diagram here on the screen, you should be familiar with this concept of the plot diagram. You've probably talked about it in just about every year of English. And you should remember that it means that every story follows the same pattern, where you begin with exposition, where we find out about characters in some conflict, and then those characters attempt to solve the conflict, and they do a bunch of things, and we go through this rising action where they're trying to accomplish what they want to accomplish, and it's hard. And then there is a climax of some kind. Some definitive thing happens that decides how the story is going to end. Falling action as the characters come to terms with the fact that they've passed that climactic moment. And then the denouement at the end, where the conflict gets wrapped up and things are over. Now, every piece of written storytelling that you've ever encountered follows a pattern somewhat like this, but real life obviously does not. If you sat down and just wrote all the things that happened to you over the course of a day, you wouldn't have a story that follows this pattern. You would just have a big mess. And there would be some funny things and some sad things and some things that got wrapped up and some things that didn't, and quite a few things that didn't even make a whole lot of sense. So when somebody like Jeanette Walls sits down to take episodes from their life and turn them into a narrative, they make a lot of decisions about how to arrange that story into a plot like this that makes sense. And those decisions are a good example of rhetoric, because they are consciously selecting what details to include and how to emphasize them in order to affect the way you respond to the story. If we're going to start thinking about storytelling, we should probably start with the journalist questions. The journalist questions, as you may already know, are who, did what, when, where, why, and how. We call them the journalist questions because a newspaper story is going to go through and answer those 6 questions for you. And we could look at most stories and define them in terms of those questions. But think about how there are different answers to those questions depending on your perspective on the events that happen. Think about like the Glass Castle. Is the who Jeanette Walls? Or is it Rex Walls? Or is it the Walls family? What did they do? Did they grow up? Did they struggle with difficulties? Did they struggle with alcoholism? Obviously, when is going to be somewhat constant, and where, but Jeanette made a decision to tell a very long story that involved her family moving across the country over time, where she could have focused it in on 1 or 2 particular incidents. Certainly, why, as a question, requires some interpretation. I'm circling it now just in case you can't find it. Why as a question requires quite a bit of interpretation, and there's going to be very different answers on why things happened. And how depends a lot on, did we decide to tell a story about Jeanette Walls, or did we decide to tell a story about Rex Walls? What they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're doing it are going to be different. So if Lori, for example, Jeanette's older sister, had sat down to write a memoir, a bit of narrative nonfiction writing about her life, it might look different than Jeanette's, and we would hear about different things, and the focus would be on different things, and we'd have different answers to these questions. The handout that you have on Burke's Pentad takes this kind of a step further, and it points out that everyone, when they're writing a narrative, makes a decision on what's the most important element. What was the thing that caused the events to happen? And in that handout, it talks about a sort of a more advanced way of thinking about those journalist questions. Burke breaks things down into the act that takes place, the scene, the agent, the agency, and the purpose. So the act is obviously the thing that happened. So I'm going to continue talking about that Lou Gehrig speech that I was talking about in the earlier videos, and that's included in your language of composition book, just because it's something we're all familiar with. So the act is something like Lou Gehrig delivered a speech about his retirement from baseball. The scene is both the when and the where something took place. So the scene here is Yankee Stadium on the 4th of July in 1939. The agent is the person who's doing the action. So it's Lou Gehrig. The agency, and this is the word that you might have the least familiarity with, the agency is what allows the action to take place, or why the agent, is capable of doing that act. So in this case, the agency is something like the management of the Yankees invited him to do it, or maybe it's something like it was at a point in history where now there was mass communication and a speech like this could be recorded and sent all over the world, or something like that. And the purpose is what was Lou Gehrig attempting to accomplish in giving this speech, which we talked about a lot in one of the previous videos, but is something about adjusting his audience's perceptions of his illness. So already you have decisions that you have to make about, for example, who is the actor here? Are we going to tell a story about Lou Gehrig giving a speech? Or is the actor someone who's in the audience listening to the speech, right? But then once you've made those decisions, we get into a more complicated process of building those ratios. So what you have to do is decide how you want to lay out your story, where you're going to emphasize the things that are taking place. And according to Burke, you do that by creating these ratios between one of the other elements of the narrative and the act that took place. So for example, if you were telling the story of Lou Gehrig's farewell speech and you wanted to build an agent-act ratio, you would tell a story about how Lou Gehrig was a simple, honest, hardworking man who was able to speak from his heart and say goodbye to the fans that he had earned through his heroics on the field. So in that case, what I just did was take this story and lay it out in terms basically of the agent. That it's because of qualities about Lou Gehrig that this event took place. But let's say that instead you wanted to tell this story as a scene act type narrative. In that case, you're going to say something like, the simpler time that was the 1930s and the magical place that was Yankee Stadium gave Lou Gehrig's farewell speech its magic. So now we're saying that this event was important, or this act took place because of the when and the where. That it was something about Yankee Stadium in 1939, in this period in American history. I mean, maybe you want to do something with the fact that it was the 4th of July. That obviously has certain resonance and is part of the scene. Maybe you want to talk about the fact that the nation was worried about World War II at the time and looking at Gehrig as this sort of heroic figure. But in all those cases, you're dealing with the scene as being responsible for the act that took place. Maybe you want to talk about it in terms of the agency act. And now we have a narrative that's something like the technological innovations of microphones, radio broadcasting, and video recording allowed Lou Gehrig to speak to millions. That what your story is about is the opportunity that was created for Gehrig to give his speech. Maybe you want to talk about purpose act. And again, we basically covered that when we were looking at the rhetorical triangle. But you're going to say something like Lou Gehrig spoke to all his fans because he wanted to change public perception of his illness. So why is he speaking? That becomes what's most important. Or the fifth way to do it is act. That some other event that has already taken place is what directly caused this one. So something like Lou Gehrig was so moved by the outpouring of support he received, he decided to speak to the crowd. So you could tell any one of those 5 stories that I just outlined about Lou Gehrig's farewell address, and they would all be accurate and they would all be different. So again, in trying to take this event, Lou Gehrig's speech, that was something that happened in real life where a whole lot of stuff is just happening all the time in a kind of random haphazard way sometimes, and turning it into something that follows that plot diagram that we looked at in the first slide, you have to make decisions that are going to really change the way your story looks to an audience. So let's think about this guy who got this A+ on his test here. Now, there's any number of things that went on in and around the time that he earned this A+ or was given this A+. But think about how he might want to present this story to his parents. He might make it an agent act story where because he studied and worked hard, he got an A+. Think about, though, how the school would present that story. That this, they would instead play up the scene act ratio and talk about how the school was this wonderful learning environment that allowed this to take place. Maybe the teacher is going to talk about how the way that she sets up her classroom allows students to succeed, and she's going to play up like an agency act. Maybe if the parents are explaining to the kid why he needs to work hard, they'll play up the purpose act and talk about how working hard to study for a test like this is going to allow him to go to college someday. Or maybe it's an act-act ratio. Maybe he got an A on this test because he got an F on the previous test and wanted to do better. Again, all of those stories are valid, but in order to tell a story about something that happened in real life, you have to make decisions about which aspect of the ratio to emphasize. So think about Glass Castle and the way Jeanette Walls does that. Does she think that the things happen in that story because of certain characters? Does she think that the things happen in that story because of the environment or the opportunities that they had or what they thought was important in life and what they were trying to accomplish, or what things that happened in the past that caused other things to happen? Well, clearly over the course of that entire work, she sets up varying examples of all 5 of those ratios. Why does she select certain ratios for certain scenes? When she's talking about Rex doing something and then she talks about her mother doing something, does she use different ratios? She has to make those decisions, and they are a good example of rhetoric in action because she's making conscious choices that affect the impact her story has on her reader.